Hello, World Economic News for Friday. And we'll open with the chart, which is what do you consider the biggest tail risk, as in black swan, or what bad could go wrong. And this is from Merrill Lynch, and May, even more than April, they think the EU sovereign debt funding is the biggest problem out there. Commodity price inflation has receded, and other things, premature fiscal tightening, Chinese real estate market blowing up, or municipal defaults in the US. That's what they think. Let's move to the Guardian co-UK, seeing we've got EU problems as the number one tail risk or problem area. Could Greece be the next Lehman Brothers? Yes, and potentially even worse. If Athens reneged on its debts, it would shatter the market's confidence in the Eurozone project. And this is a very good article describing the whole Greece and Eurozone problems. But it opens up thus. It was less than 3 years ago that the failure of Lehman Brothers sent tremors through the global financial system, threatening the existence of every major bank and triggering the most severe economic crisis since the Great Depression. Now, I'll repeat, that article is very, very worth reading, but the opening sentence there I think is wrong. In its own way, it's wrong, and I'll point out this. It was less than 3 years ago that the failure of Lehman Brothers sent tremors through the global financial system. I don't think it was the failure of Lehman Brothers that did this sending of tremors. Let's move on to the Daily Reckoning, and an article, again, a good article, in an under-collateralized world. In other words, what we're living in is an under-collateralized world, and that's what the article's about. But I've dragged out these two paragraphs which kind of will say what I would have said about why it wasn't directly Lehman Brothers that shattered the economic world. Rather than confronting sources of volatility, policymakers have sought to smooth out volatility at all costs. Unfortunately, these costs are proving to be very high and will ultimately prove prohibitive. Pressures build inside complex systems until they can no longer be suppressed. When these pressures can no longer be contained, they tend to erupt with far greater violence than had they been allowed to adjust earlier. Nothing new, but we've got the idea of building up pressure and the authorities trying to keep it damped down. Lewitt continued, Federal Reserve Chairman Greenspan and Bernanke convinced investors the Fed would bail them out if the economy or markets got into serious trouble. As a result, investors engaged in increasingly reckless behavior. The result, rather than saving the markets, Mr. Greenspan's philosophy and the approach guaranteed their failure. One of the consequences is the build-up of unsustainable debt levels and this under-collateralized affair that we have. But the answer, I think, there is Federal Reserve Chairman convinced investors the Fed would bail them out if the economy or markets got into serious trouble, or banks like Lehman Brothers got into serious trouble. It was the shattering of the illusion, or the illusion that the Fed would always be there to bail everybody out and make everything better. They were living in a fairy tale world where the Fed would always have their back, and it was that shattered the whole economic world. It was when the Fed didn't come in behind Lehman, as was expected, and all planning was predicated on the Fed making everything always better. It just happened to be Lehman. Move to the pink picks, which are Financial Times articles, and John Gapper article, Don't Close the Lid on Bank Fraud, and a nice little picture, cartoon a man peering into a tin labelled mortgage crisis, and it's a can of worms. Those are worms coming out there. The news this week that Eric Schneiderman, the New York Attorney General, has launched yet another inquiry into Wall Street's role in the mortgage crisis will no doubt be greeted with groans at investment banks, the FT columnist writes. 4 years and multiple investigations after the meltdown started at two Bear Stearns hedge funds. Isn't it time to move on? I think not, for there is still work to be done, and if you want a solid future, there's an awful lot of work that needs doing. Finding out what went wrong in the past, finding out what was illegal, and punishing that illegality, and finding out what might not have been illegal, but we don't want to see it again in the future, and making it illegal in the future, and stressing what will happen if the law is broken, and then stick to it. Another pink pick is David Pilling, Why Beijing Must End Inflation or Else. There's one extreme method of dealing with inflation, that is to ban it. This month, Unilever agreed to pay a fine of $300,000 after China's National Development and Reform Commission accused the Anglo-Dutch company of creating panic by announcing its intention to increase detergent and soap prices. Such reckless behaviour was described as an ugly habit, that serious distorted market order. But even in a planned economy, such ugliness is hard to airbrush out. And we'll get back to China in the end. Interesting, just to hold in the back of our minds, this is LA containerized cargo, Los Angeles, biggest import certainly on the west coast. Is Miami bigger on the east coast? Let's do exports first. What is the United States exporting? Top 5 exports: waste paper, cotton, grain products, scrap metal and animal feeds are going out of the United States. Coming in as top 5 imports are furniture, footwear, toys, automobile parts and apparel. And a note at the bottom, everything going out is raw goods. Everything coming in is finished goods. Must mean something. The whole of this scribid, it is a scribid paper. Richard Koo Nomura, he of Balance Sheet Recession, gives us this chart. Going along the bottom, that dotted line, going up, is towards the end of 2008. We can see the red line going up, is the monetary base. That's the Fed and reserves, bank reserves, going up and up and up and up and up. But the M2 money supply is effectively flat all the way along that blue line, and the green is loans and leases in bank credit. In other words, who's borrowing, and that is going down. All that quantitative easing and all that expansion of Fed balance sheet is doing absolutely no good in the real world. And consumer spending deflator, which is his way of looking at things, as you can see, consumer spending going down and down and down. It's doing no good at all in the real world. And a note at the bottom, if you read, that's the head of the next paragraph, quantitative easing has had no effect in the UK either. Link is below. Telegraph Co UK, number of women on the dole, that's out of work, hits 15-year high. The number of women claiming job seekers allowance has reached its highest in 15 years, raising fears for how Britain's female workforce is faring in the wake of the recession. Strangely, it seems to be more men being put out of work in America. Telegraph again. Time to get worried about the household squeeze. Proof the squeeze on households is no longer dribbling out in the occasional poor retail sales figures. It's flowing thick and fast and pretty much everywhere you turn. Since the start of the year, retail sales values have crumbled, according to the Bank of England, and anecdotal evidence of how cash-strapped the country now is has gathered into a flood. Running out of money. Will not borrow. Later in this article we get consumers may exert some upward pressure on nominal wages to the extent that workers sought to maintain real living standards, that's the Bank of England, said. But there is little suggestion that companies need to concede much ground. Do you want that again? No, you don't need it again. Let's finish with the control of China on their economy. A glaring case of Chinese central planning going awry. The hot China theme these days is the country is addicted to centrally planned investment, and it's all coming off the rails. This is about their oil and refining their oil. Despite 3 government-mandated price hikes since last December, domestic refining margins have become negative in recent months. The big refiners can't make money because they are told what price to take oil in at and what price they can accept for their refined products going out. And even small teapot refineries, which have traditionally helped to fill the supply gap, are also facing poor economics, with many reportedly shutting down or running at some 30% of capacity. If they can't get the money, they just go and work in the fields until they're guaranteed a profit. Meanwhile, in late April, Shanghai was the theatre of an unprecedented 3-day strike by truck drivers. The protests were reportedly triggered by high gasoil prices, gasoline, diesel prices. So although they're keeping the prices down as low as they can, they're still too high. So what should the central authority do? In terms of policy remedies, increasing domestic prices sufficiently to guarantee reasonable refining margins, or alternatively, fully deregulating the market, is probably not an option at this point, given stubborn inflation. Subsidizing refiners directly or cutting the fuel consumption tax, as refiners have demanded, are other options, but neither has so far been implemented. And there we have it. They can do these power politics things of designated this, this and this, or they can fully deregulate the market, which they're not going to do. So the decisions fall on a small bunch of people to do the right thing. Obviously, you've got open market and you've got this power politics thing, pointing fingers and saying what should be done and which is best. Obviously, some reasonable middle ground, but I think what we've got is another peak we're over the peak in reasonable middle ground people to do reasonable middle ground things. So everything's a big fight and the little people always lose and the big people always win. Bye. Good weekend.